Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. My guest this month is David Bushman, author or co-author of several Twin Peaks related books, including Conversations with Mark Frost, Twin Peaks FAQ with Arthur Smith, and the forthcoming Murder at Teal's Pond, Hazel Drew and the Mystery That Inspired Twin Peaks with Mark Givens. This conversation will be split over YouTube, where we will dig into that Hazel Drew mystery, as well as Bushman's general thoughts on Twin Peaks co-creator Mark Frost, and also Patreon, where more than half the conversation is reserved for the $5 a month tier. And there we go much deeper in our conversation about Frost's contributions to Twin Peaks and his relationship to David Lynch, among other topics. Before we begin the conversation, an update on my work, behind the scenes and recently published. I'm still in the third phase of my path back to Journey Through Twin Peaks, creating my backlog of work for the rest of 2021. I just concluded step 15, which leaves 21 steps before resuming Journey Through Twin Peaks. You can check out my regularly updated Path Back schedule linked below, or the associated Twitter threads to keep track of my progress. At the moment, I'm actually about to jump ahead a few steps to make sure that the public version of my Lost in Twin Peaks podcast, which is an episode guide to the entire series, split into small daily episodes, is going to be ready to kick off this weekend as scheduled. I will also be jumping ahead to create a Patreon podcast for next week involving the David Lynch version of Dune as a tie-in to the new version of Dune hitting theaters this weekend. After that, I'll return to the plan and begin work on my political podcast, Left to the Movies, for October, which will officially debut on its own feed with the documentary The Battle of Chile. As for recent work, my last update was just a week ago for the bonus Twin Peaks conversation with the hosts of Twin Peaks Unwrapped, so I don't have too much to add since then. My Mad Men Season 6 viewing diary continues to publish every Monday. I shared a newly recorded public podcast on the film Arrival as part of a mini-focus on Denis Villeneuve leading up to his new film Dune. And I shared that Twin Peaks Unwrapped conversation, which you can find on this channel or linked below, including, in that case, a 50-minute bonus conversation on Patreon. On Friday, I published a status update further outlining my work for the fall. With that, let's open the conversation with David Bushman. So I'm here for Twin Peaks Conversations with David Bushman. Many of you listening may already be familiar with his work. He's written Conversations with Mark Frost and the upcoming Murder at Teal's Pond. Do I have that title right, about the Hazel Drew mystery?
You do. The subtitle is Hazel Drew and the Mystery That Inspired Twin Peaks.
Great. Okay, so we're going to talk about both of those books as well as any other subjects that come up along the way. And I guess to start off with, why don't you introduce yourself to those who aren't familiar with you, just what you do. I know you work for the Paley Center in New York, and how that brought you to Twin Peaks and where you are now.
Well, I did work for the Paley Center for 27 years, but I actually left there in January of 2020 to focus on the Hazel Drew book. So I'm right now just basically authoring, and also I'm co-running with Scott Ryan, who is the publisher of Blue Rose Magazine, a publishing company called Fayetteville Mafia Press. We've published the Mark Frost book and also a bunch of other books. We did Laura's Ghost by Courtney Stallings, which is about the impact of the Laura Palmer story on Twin Peaks fans who have survived traumas of their own. Scott's got a book coming out on Fire Walk with Me in 2022. And I also, my first exposure to Twin Peaks was, I was a TV editor at Variety in New York, and that was right around the time that Twin Peaks made all this news, because the trade, the industry was so excited that David Lynch was coming to TV. So we ran a lot of stories about that, and about Lynch coming to TV, and then about how ABC was delaying it. So that was where I first sort of became familiar with Twin Peaks. And then the Paley Center also did an event really early on with Mark and Kyle and a couple of other people. It was one of the stops on their tour when they were trying to get it onto ABC. Mark and David were trying to get it onto ABC, so they screened it in a few places, like the DGA was one, and we were called the Museum of TV and Radio then. That was another one. And so we were one of the first people to screen it and do a panel on it. So there is that history to it. Yeah.
That's interesting. I know, or I've encountered a few people who were able to see Twin Peaks before it premiered, and another saw it, I think, at the Miami Film Festival or something. It was shown like maybe a few weeks or months before the TV premiere, and it's just such an interesting way to be introduced to that world that was going to become a mass phenomenon almost momentarily, but you were getting sort of a sneak peek into it ahead of time.
Yeah, and that was all about them trying to pressure the network into putting, trying to get the word of mouth going to pressure the network to finally put it on the air.
Yeah, and it seemed to have worked. I mean, it was such a
Yeah.
big hit at least at first. So let's introduce this topic of Hazel Drew. Can you explain to the listeners who she is, what
Yeah.
drew you to this story, and how it's developed with the book that you've written and other projects you've been engaged with?
Yeah, so we have this book coming out in January of 2022 called Murder at Teal's Pond: The Mystery of Hazel Drew. I'm sorry, Hazel Drew and the Mystery That Inspired Twin Peaks. And I'm co-writing it with Mark Givens, who you may know from the Deer Meadow radio podcast. When I was researching Twin Peaks FAQ, I came across Mark Frost's reference to a murder in upstate New York that his grandmother had told him and his brother Scott about when they were young, and they used to visit her on during the summer at her upstate New York house. And he referenced a woman named Hazel. He thought her name was Hazel Gray, and he didn't mention the specific town that she was in either. So that was something that intrigued me a lot, but I didn't go into it deeply in the book. And but I did research it to the point where I discovered that it was not Hazel Gray, but Hazel Drew, and I found out where it happened. And separately, Mark Givens, for his podcast, was also intrigued enough by it to look into it, and came to the same conclusion I did. And it's actually what turned out to be one of two stories that influenced Mark Frost uh, when he was coming up with the Laura Palmer arc, and specifically even the beginning where her body is found on a bank of a lake, because Hazel's body was found in a pond. But so it turned out to be one of two stories that influenced him. But I reached out to Mark Givens and said, would you be interested in writing a book about this? And Mark said yes. So we spent about 6 years on this book and researching and writing this book. And we did an article somewhere along the line for the Washington Post. We talked to Mark Frost, we talked to Scott Frost about it. And it's really and it was never solved. They never publicly identified the murder. Nobody ever went to jail for it. And we feel, or I feel, that if Hazel Drew had been a man or had come from a wealthy background or a privileged background, that they might not have been quite so quick to let it go. So we think there was some influence wielded. I mean, we come up with a solution that we think is very plausible. It's not easy to research a 113-year-old murder, but we think we came up with a solution that makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of similarities, as we talked about, to Laura, between Hazel and Laura, and this whole mystique around Hazel that also existed around Laura. Certainly the fact that Hazel lived a secret life, or a double life like Laura. The fact that whereas Laura had a diary, Hazel, police or investigators found a lot of her letters that she had written that they were able to read. So there was that sort of written component that enabled them to recreate secret parts of her life. The town used to be a sawmill town. It has two mountain peaks. And, a lot of these things Mark Frost wasn't even thinking about, because he had a very vague or general understanding of the situation. His grandmother used to tell him and Scott the story that Laura's ghost was haunting the woods where her body was found and where she was probably murdered, in order to get him and Scott to not stay out late, to come home early, and to kind of scare them into coming home early. So Mark had a very sort of general vague impression of the story, but it turned out that there were a lot of coincidences, I guess. And anyway, it turned out to be this really fascinating story. And she turned out to be this fascinating character who had all these secret things going on in her life. And, it's just really so much fun, I guess, to immerse yourself in the world of 1908, especially when, there was a pandemic going on and there was like a crazy presidency going on, and just to sort of escape into this. So Twin Peaks was our entry into this. Mark Frost writes the forward to the book. We tie it into Twin Peaks in the introduction and in the conclusion, but the rest of it is sort of told contemporaneously. So it's what they call creative nonfiction. So we sort of used a lot of conversations that we got through the newspaper and other sources, but we also imagined some conversations. Like if, we read, for example, that the DA spoke to her aunt, and we didn't have that conversation. We sort of invented some of the dialogue. So, and it was tremendous fun, and I think it's a really engaging story, and it would be particularly engaging, I think, for Twin Peaks fans.
The class difference between Laura and Hazel, I think, is an interesting aspect of it, and actually, in some ways, reminded me of Teresa, where I think, she had a sort of a respectable public reputation, but she was obviously lower class. She was like a house servant, I think. Were you struck by that as well? I think you were the one who brought it up, that sort of brought it to my attention. How did that kind of make these two stories, aside from the fact that they're fiction and nonfiction, unfold in different ways in your mind?
Well, Hazel was from a poor family, but she traveled in very powerful circles. All three of her employers in Troy, New York, were very wealthy, powerful people. And so she was surrounded by the sort of power and influence and wealth that Laura's, you don't get the sense that Laura's wealthy, but certainly you get the sense that her father works for one of the most powerful men. The family sort of orbits around power
Mhm.
and wealth. There is some connection to Laura. Hazel was also somebody who had this mystique about her in a way that Laura did, that I didn't get from Teresa. She was somebody who everybody talked about how beautiful and charismatic she was. In a lot of ways, she reminds me a lot more of Laura
Mhm.
than of Teresa. But I mean, certainly from an economic standpoint, you're right on the money. Her background is more similar to Teresa's, but Teresa again didn't have those connections to the powerful lead in Deer Meadow or Twin Peaks or wherever.
Now, the original title of the book from the interviews that I've seen was Blonde, Beautiful, and Dead. Out of curiosity, why did that, when and why did that change
Let
to
me
Murder
flip
at
that
Teal's
question.
Pond?
Let me flip that question around on you, Joel. What do you think of Blonde, Beautiful, and Dead? Just
uh,
seriously, what do you think of it?
I guess sort of tabloidy.
Yeah, that's what Mark Givens and I thought. It was a little
Interesting.
tawdry. Yeah, but
Yeah.
our original publisher uh, liked that, and then they sold it to Thomas and Mercer, and we kind of spoke up and got them to change it.
Yeah, I think this, I get more of like a historical sense from this title versus The Blonde, Beautiful, and Dead, probably just from mental associations would expect something in, like, I don't know, the 60s and 70s, or just a different era of crime and the underworld and all of that. Kind of
Yeah, I was kind of
interesting.
embarrassed to tell people that the title was Blonde, Beautiful, and Dead, but so fortunately we prevailed. We have also sold documentary rights to our book, and Amazon has an option on whether to do anything else with it or not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You came up with a lot of interesting facts and discoveries somewhat early on in the process. Like, I know that Washington Post article was, what was that, 2018 or 2017 or something like that? It was several years ago. Do you think you reached the conclusions or discovered the things you were going to discover early on and then worked to flesh it out? Or were there more discoveries and things happening just even in the last year or two?
Yeah, the reason that story appeared in the Post was because the return was coming, and so that we were able
Ah,
to sort
yeah.
of tie interest into it to that. But the answer to your question is definitely later in the process. By the time when we were writing that article for the Washington Post, we had no idea where where the story was going, and that all happened much later in the process. The deeper we dug, and we had
Yeah.
people also on the ground like Mark Marshall and Bob Moore in particular, helping us from up there with the investigation. We had a former FBI agent
Oh, interesting.
who was a friend of a friend, and he was working with us for a while, and then he just like disappeared. We don't know what happened to him, but he
He
was
reached under a trailer for a ring.
right, right. So maybe he'll be in season 4. I don't know, but um, yeah. So we did a ton of research between the return and the finishing the book, and that's where we sort of came up with what we think is the solution.
True crime is sort of an interesting genre, I guess, to work in. I was actually seeing somebody sort of touch on this a little last night in some different ways, but just happened to be like scrolling through Twitter and somebody mentioned it. But it's a little different when you're working with something from a century ago and everybody's dead, but there still must be some sort of sense of responsibility if you're identifying suspects and discussing the evidence and coming to some conclusions. Like, how did you deal with that kind of issue? Because obviously, on the one hand, there's nobody really around to be offended anymore. On the other hand, they can't defend themselves either. So it's sort of you have to tread lightly, I would imagine.
The way we dealt with that, to answer your question, is that we have a publisher that has it's owned by Amazon. It had the resources to give it a legal read, and so we feel that that we um, did our due diligence in terms
Yeah.
of whether or not there was anything legally questionable about what we were doing, since it had been through a legal read.
And from just an ethical standpoint, I'd imagine you have to feel fairly, I mean, I guess it depends on how you phrase it. I haven't read it yet, obviously it hasn't come out, but you have to kind of if you're drawing a somewhat definitive conclusion, you would imagine have to be pretty confident in it.
We
Would
are.
that yeah. And when does this book come out?
So this book comes out in January of 2022. It's being
Mhm.
published by Thomas and Mercer. Um,
Okay. And of course, Conversation with Mark Frost has been out since early 2020, and Twin Peaks FAQ, uh, is that in print right now? That was 5 years ago, right? With
yeah,
Arthur Smith.
yes, it's still in print. Conversations with Mark Frost is from the publishing company that Scott Ryan and I started, called Fayetteville Mafia Press, and that you can actually, I mean, you can buy that on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, but it's also available at a cheaper price on our website. If I can do some shameless
Sure, we'll
self
put that
promotion.
in there for sure.
Okay, it's
Now,
fayetteville.mafia.com, but as of January, they'll all be out there.
you've said in the past, from what I've seen, that for many years your focus was kind of on David Lynch as being the prime mover behind Twin Peaks, and I think many people would feel that way. But what was it? Was it the Hazel Drew mystery itself that, and if so, you can sort of explain how, but was that what redirected some of your attention toward Frost to the point of eventually interviewing him and making a real case for him in print as an equal partner in Twin Peaks and an undersung creative influence there?
Well, it was a little bit about writing the book, Twin Peaks FAQ. That was a little bit there, but I would say I went into the Mark Frost book, the Conversations with Mark Frost. I went into that not. Let me rephrase that. I came out of that with a hugely different appreciation of Mark that I had going in. It turned out that I was way more impressed with everything about him, including his contribution to Twin Peaks, after talking to him 20 some odd times than I
Mhm.
was going in. I was even going in, I was somewhat susceptible to this general misperception that Twin Peaks was, you know, essentially a David Frost creation, which I totally reject now.
Or
Um,
David Lynch.
David Lynch, right?
Yeah.
What did I say? David Frost,
Yeah, that was the TV host, right? With
right?
Nixon.
Yeah, yeah. David Lynch, which I totally reject now. So I would say even between the time, the difference between going in and coming out of the project was huge.
What was it that, besides just sort of starting to think about it with the Twin Peaks FAQ book, but what was it that really got you to want to write that book in the first place? Because that's an interesting point, that even when you were starting the book, you weren't as focused on the idea of Frost as being as important as he was. So even with that being the case, why was it, out of curiosity, that you thought this would be a book that you wanted to write?
Well, part of it was as a TV historian, as a curator at the Paley Center, I was really intrigued by the idea that he had started in TV in the 70s at, the most prominent TV studio for producing TV programming, was contemporary of people like Stephen Bochco and Levinson and Link and Ray Huggins. I mean, he was younger than those guys, but he was around for that time. And then he was, it was an interesting story. He had left Hollywood in the middle of that, just picked up and left because it wasn't creatively rewarding enough to him. I knew this going in, and then he worked on one of the most influential TV shows in history, Hill Street Blues, with people like Bochco and David Milch, who are extremely important people. And then he played a role in Twin Peaks. So he was around for some really interesting periods of TV history. And I was a TV historian, and I was kind of interested in telling that story. And also I was interested in exploring exactly what his, I felt like it was perhaps there was a misperception, or perhaps, but I had no idea the extent of it. I mean, not just Twin Peaks either. I mean, I went back and read stories about American Chronicles, for example, where the headlines are all like Lynch's American Chronicles, and the stories are all about how Lynch is doing this docudrama, and in fact, he had absolutely nothing to do with it. Literally nothing to do with it, and even and then during the course of conversations with Mark Frost, although Mark Frost never diminished in any way David Lynch's contributions to Twin Peaks, but you just ask enough questions, and you find out that he was barely around for season one, and barely involved in season two, other than what he directed and his appearances as Gordon Cole. So I thought, media gets so many things wrong. So I knew that there was what the FAQ book did was raise for me the possibility that it was a misperception. But going into that book, I still thought, oh, the things that people remember Twin Peaks for, like the Man from Another Place, or the Red Room, or all this weird iconography, that was David Lynch. But there's so much more to Twin Peaks than that, and that's really what this process of discovery was for me.
So you knew going in a bit about his role in TV history in the 70s and 80s and Hill Street Blues, and obviously you knew about his involvement with Twin Peaks, but what surprised you most about Frost and his career once you had talked to him? Like, what to you was the biggest discovery of this process of writing this book?
Well, I would say that the biggest discovery are kind of the themes that I delineate in the introduction to the book, which is that, and some of these are Twin Peaks related themes. One is that he was, hugely responsible for the success of Twin Peaks, that that his contribution is underappreciated, that he took one thing, that was not Twin Peaks related, that was a real revelation for me, was, in the middle of, he was making a living in Hollywood as a writer, and he just picked up and left and went back to Minnesota, and wound up having a very difficult time financially to write plays. And he made a documentary while I was there. It was not creatively satisfying for him. So the fact that he took that risk was hugely impressive to me. So much of the warmth and humanistic elements of Twin Peaks are about Mark Frost more than David Lynch. And if you listen to people like David Chase or Sam Esmail talk about what influenced them, so many people mention Twin Peaks. Mark Frost is 50% of the team that changed the landscape of television history. And that to me is just not acknowledged enough.
As far as his, for me, I think reading his work and watching his work, I was really struck by, this was a surprise for me, I think, the extent to which it's really his post Twin Peaks work that in many ways is the most defining of him as an artist, both in terms of the consistency of themes, but also just the wild range, the eclectic range of mediums and genres. And it's almost like Twin Peaks kind of liberated him to be his own artist in a way. At least that was the impression I got.
Well, I think, Joel, I think that's a really perceptive point, and I think it's true. And I think he even says during the course of the book that Twin Peaks is where he
Yeah.
had the freedom to sort of develop that and come into who he was. And so I think that's a great point, and I think it's 100% accurate. I don't think that anything post Twin Peaks has had, other than The Return, perhaps, has had the influence that Twin Peaks did. But I think, looking at his development as an artist, I think you're 100% right.
What do you see in terms of looking back over the work, both in terms of its relation to the original series and eventually, the return, sandwiching it on the other side? Which of his works did you find the most illuminating in terms of how it would inspire you to see Twin Peaks itself in a different light? Was there any particular book or TV work that you just found particularly kind of eye opening in that regard?
People always describe David Lynch as a surrealist. What would you describe yourself as? And he said a humanist. And I think you really start to see that develop gradually over time. I mean, I loved reading his Jack Sparks novels. I really loved those. I loved reading the World War II novel. A couple of things. One was the way he would look at the whole concept of evil. There's two sides to human nature, and how one sort of overwhelms the other, either for good or for bad. And that's a theme that I think comes up a lot in Twin Peaks as well. But those books are not necessarily that well known because they were never adapted to film or television. But they're really evil. They're really interesting in terms of the exploration of human nature and the role that choice plays in determining who we become. So I really enjoyed those novels in particular.
That's an interesting point to bring up, I think, in terms of it, how it relates to Twin Peaks, because we'll leave the public conversation there. But of course, this conversation continues on Patreon for $5 a month patrons. We discuss a lot of other stuff about the Lynch Frost collaboration, the balance of it, who knew what, when, maybe, and talking about the last line of the show, about the Leland Bob split, about the process of making it in 1990 versus 27 or 2015, and whose strengths that played to as a co-creator. So a lot of great material there. We also get into Frost's other work on Hill Street Blues and why 80s shows maybe, digging into why maybe they haven't lasted as long in some ways, the 80s dramas, as later or earlier shows have, and lots of other topics in there. We don't further discuss the Hazel Drew stuff. That's all in this public podcast. However, I will be doing a conversation interview in the coming months, probably around January, with Mark Givens, the co-author of that book. So we'll be digging more into that topic there. But for much more Mark Frost and TV and a lot of Twin Peaks, I encourage you to follow the link below and become a patron. And you can find links as well to his books and everything else that you may be curious about from this conversation in that description for the YouTube video. Thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you hopefully on the other end of this, and also next time in October when I continue with a monthly Twin Peaks conversation schedule.